February 17, 1940, Wilhelmshaven, Germany. The pencil scratched across the operational map as Major Erich von Selle marked another successful interception. His pilots from Jagdgeschwader 1 had just claimed 4 RAF bombers shot down with 0 losses. The mathematics seemed to confirm everything the Luftwaffe High Command believed about British bomber doctrine: heavy, slow, inadequately defended targets flying predictable routes in broad daylight. Von Selle permitted himself a rare smile as he briefed his squadron leaders that evening. "The English are sending us gifts wrapped in aluminium," he told them. "Their bombers are flying coffins." Across the North Sea, Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding read the loss reports from that day's raid with a face like granite. 4 Vickers Wellingtons gone, 32 men missing or dead. The third failed daylight bombing raid in as many weeks. The German fighters were slaughtering his bomber crews, and everyone from the Air Ministry to Churchill himself was demanding answers. Britain desperately needed to strike back at German industrial targets to show Hitler that the Royal Air Force could hit the Reich where it hurt. But sending unescorted bombers into German airspace in daylight was proving suicidal. What von Selle and the confident Luftwaffe didn't know was that British engineers were already working on something that would transform their easy targets into flying fortresses. A new aircraft was taking shape in the design halls of Vickers Armstrong, one that would force the Germans to completely rewrite their tactical doctrine. The first prototype had flown just 3 months earlier. Within 2 years, it would become the aircraft that German fighter pilots feared above all others. The aircraft that would, on one terrible August day in 1943, cost the Luftwaffe 60 fighters in a single mission. The Germans were about to discover that underestimating British resolve was the first step toward catastrophic defeat. The early months of 1940 painted a grim picture for RAF Bomber Command. The philosophy seemed sound on paper. Daylight precision bombing would allow British crews to hit specific industrial targets with accuracy that night bombing couldn't achieve. The Vickers Wellington, the workhorse of Bomber Command, was a rugged aircraft with geodetic construction that could absorb tremendous punishment. The air staff believed these sturdy bombers, flying in defensive formations, could fight their way to targets and back. The Germans proved them catastrophically wrong. On December 18, 1939, 24 Wellingtons from No. 99 Squadron attacked German warships at Wilhelmshaven. The formation was spotted by German radar stations while still over the North Sea. Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters from Jagdgeschwader 77 were already climbing to intercept altitude before the British bombers even reached the German coast. Oberleutnant Helmut Lent, leading his staffel of 9 fighters, described the engagement in his combat report that evening. "We positioned ourselves 4,000 meters above the English formation. They flew straight and level, making no evasive maneuvers. It was like shooting practice at the fighter school. We dove through them twice. The bombers exploded or fell away burning. Some tried to return fire, but their guns couldn't track our speed. The massacre lasted 17 minutes. 12 Wellingtons were shot down. That's half the attacking force. 108 British airmen went down with their aircraft." The survivors who limped back to England brought reports of German fighters attacking from positions where the Wellingtons' defensive guns couldn't reach them. The Messerschmitts would climb above the formation, roll inverted, and dive through at speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. By the time the British gunners could react, the German fighters were already below them, climbing for another attack. Wing Commander Richard Kellett, one of the surviving pilots, filed a report that should have changed everything. "The Wellington is defenseless against modern fighters attacking from above. Our defensive armament cannot elevate sufficiently to engage diving attackers. We require either fighter escort or a fundamental redesign of our defensive capabilities. Continuing daylight operations under current conditions is tantamount to murder." The Air Ministry read his report and decided that better formation tactics and improved gunnery training would solve the problem. They were wrong. Through the winter and spring of 1940, the pattern repeated itself with sickening regularity. German radar stations would detect incoming bomber formations while they were still over the sea. Luftwaffe fighters would scramble and climb to advantageous positions. Then came the diving attacks that British gunners couldn't counter. The loss rates were unsustainable. Some raids lost over 40% of the attacking force. Flight Sergeant James McLean, a Wellington rear gunner who survived 4 missions before being shot down and captured in April 1940, later told British intelligence officers about the German pilot's attitude. During interrogation, a Luftwaffe Hauptmann told me we were foolish to fly such poorly defended aircraft in daylight. He said shooting down Wellingtons was easier than their training exercises. He wasn't boasting. He was genuinely puzzled why we kept coming. The Germans had every reason for confidence. Their Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters were faster, more maneuverable, and better armed than anything Britain could put in the sky. The 109E variant, which equipped most Luftwaffe fighter units by mid-1940, could reach 350 miles per hour in level flight and could dive at speeds approaching 500 miles per hour. It carried 2 20mm cannon in the wings and 2 machine guns in the nose. Against the Wellington's fabric-covered geodetic structure and relatively light defensive armament, the 109 was devastatingly effective. By summer 1940, RAF Bomber Command had been forced to abandon daylight operations almost entirely. The losses were simply too heavy. Britain's bomber force switched to night operations, where darkness provided the protection that guns and armor couldn't. But night bombing meant reduced accuracy. Crews couldn't see their targets clearly. Navigation was difficult. Bomb aiming was largely guesswork. The German war machine continued churning out tanks and aircraft, while British bombs fell harmlessly into empty fields. The Air Ministry needed a solution. They needed a bomber that could fight back. In January 1941, at the Vickers-Armstrong plant in Weybridge, a revolutionary aircraft was taking shape. It had started as the Manchester, a twin-engine bomber that had proven dangerously unreliable due to its troublesome Rolls-Royce Vulture engines. But Chief Designer Roy Chadwick saw potential in the airframe. He proposed a radical modification: replace the 2 unreliable Vultures with 4 proven Rolls-Royce Merlin engines. The Air Ministry was skeptical. 4-engine bombers were expensive to build and maintain. They required more fuel, more crew training, more everything. But Chadwick persisted, and in January 1941, the first Lancaster prototype took to the air. The transformation was remarkable. Where the Manchester had been underpowered and dangerous, the Lancaster was powerful and stable. 4 Merlin engines, the same power plant that made the Spitfire famous, each producing 1,200 horsepower. The big bomber could carry 14,000 pounds of bombs to targets deep inside Germany. More importantly for what was coming, it could carry 8 defensive gun positions. The Lancaster featured a front turret mounting 2 Browning .303 machine guns, a dorsal turret amidships with 2 more Brownings, a ventral turret underneath with 2 guns, and most impressively, a rear turret mounting 4 Brownings. That's 10 defensive machine guns, all electrically powered, all capable of traversing quickly to meet attacks from any angle. Squadron leader John Nettleton, one of the first pilots to convert to the Lancaster in late 1941, wrote to his wife about the aircraft. "It's like comparing a lorry to a racing car when you move from the Wellington. The Lancaster is fast for a bomber, nearly 300 miles per hour at altitude. It's stable as a rock, which makes it an excellent bombing platform. But what really impresses is the defensive armament. The rear turret alone has more firepower than an entire Wellington. If the Germans try to bounce us like they did the Wellingtons, they're in for a nasty surprise." The first Lancaster squadrons formed in early 1942. Number 44 Squadron at Waddington received the first aircraft in January. Number 97 Squadron converted in February. These units spent months training, learning the new aircraft's capabilities and limitations. The crews practiced defensive tactics specifically designed to maximize the Lancaster's firepower advantage. The key innovation was the combat box formation. Instead of flying in loose Vicks like the Wellingtons had, Lancasters would fly in tight formations where each aircraft's defensive guns could protect its neighbors. An attacking fighter wouldn't face 10 guns from a single bomber. It would face 40 or 50 guns from multiple bombers, all firing simultaneously. Flight Lieutenant James Flint, a gunnery officer with Number 44 Squadron, spent weeks calculating optimal firing solutions. "We worked out that if we maintained proper spacing and discipline, an attacking fighter from any direction would face converging fire from at least 4 aircraft. That's 40 machine guns creating a cone of fire roughly 600 yards deep. Nothing could survive flying through that." But the theory needed testing, And the Luftwaffe was about to provide the testing ground. April 17, 1942, 12 Lancasters from No. 44 and No. 97 squadrons lifted off from RAF Waddington just after sunset. Their target was the MAN diesel engine factory in Augsburg, deep in southern Germany. This was the Lancasters' combat debut, and the Air Ministry had chosen a deliberately challenging target to prove the new bomber's capabilities. The raid would be flown in daylight, at low level, to achieve surprise and accuracy. Squadron leader John Nettleton, leading the first wave of 6 Lancasters, knew they were gambling with their lives, but the crews believed in their aircraft. They'd trained for this. The formation crossed the French coast at treetop height, racing across the countryside at 250 miles per hour. German radar stations designed to detect high-flying bombers missed them entirely. But near Paris, luck ran out. A Luftwaffe fighter training unit happened to be conducting exercises in the area. Oberfeldwebel Karl-Heinz Weber, flying a Messerschmitt Bf 109F, spotted the Lancaster formation skimming over the trees. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. British bombers flying in broad daylight without escort. He immediately radioed his staffel and dove to attack. What happened next shocked him. Weber positioned himself astern of the last Lancaster and opened fire from 400 yards. His 20mm cannon shells walked up toward the bomber's tail. Then the rear turret swung around with shocking speed, and 4 Browning machine guns opened up. Tracers streamed past Weber's canopy. He broke left violently, rolling away from the concentrated fire. These were not the Wellingtons we'd practiced against, Weber recalled in a 1978 interview with British aviation historians. The rear turret tracked me through my entire attack run. The volume of fire was incredible. I saw my shells hitting the bomber, but it kept flying. When I broke away, I had 3 holes in my wing and my radio was shot out. My wingman attacked from the opposite side and got the same reception. We had to break off, but more German fighters were arriving. Messerschmitt 109s from 3 different units converged on the Lancaster formation. In the running battle that followed across France, the Germans learned painful lessons about attacking these new British bombers. The Lancasters flew in a tight box formation. When fighters attacked, multiple gun turrets would swing to meet them. The German pilots found themselves facing coordinated defensive fire they'd never experienced before. Attacking one bomber meant flying through the fire of 3 or 4 others. Flight Sergeant Leonard Sumter, rear gunner in Lancaster ED 888, described the chaos. They came at us from everywhere. I counted 11 fighters at one point, but we'd practiced this. When they attacked from astern, I'd take the main target while the dorsal gunner engaged the ones trying to come in from above. The mid-upper could cover the beam attacks. It was like conducting an orchestra but with machine guns. I know I hit 3 fighters. One definitely went down smoking. The others broke off. The Germans paid for their attacks. 5 Lancasters were shot down in the running battle across France, but the Luftwaffe lost 4 fighters confirmed destroyed and several more damaged. For German pilots accustomed to easy victories against poorly defended bombers, these losses were shocking. A 1-to-1 kill ratio against bombers was unacceptable. The surviving 7 Lancasters reached Augsburg and bombed the factory in broad daylight from low altitude. The damage was significant, but more importantly, they'd survived a gauntlet of German fighters through sheer firepower. 4 Lancasters made it home to England. Nettleton, who received the Victoria Cross for leading the raid, knew they'd proved something crucial. The Lancaster could fight. The German after-action reports from that day made interesting reading. Hauptmann Hans-Joachim Marseille, one of the Luftwaffe's top aces, wrote in his combat diary, "The new British 4-engine bomber is a different proposition from their earlier types. The defensive armament is formidable. The rear turret in particular is extremely effective. We must develop new tactics." But the Luftwaffe High Command dismissed these concerns. They believed the Augsburg raid was an anomaly. British bombers still couldn't penetrate deep into Germany in daylight without catastrophic losses. They would continue to rely on inaccurate night bombing. The day bomber threat was over. They couldn't have been more wrong. Through 1942 and into 1943, Lancaster production ramped up dramatically. The Vickers-Armstrong factories at Weybridge and Chester were producing the bombers at an increasing rate. By mid-1943, new Lancasters were rolling off the production lines at a rate of over 40 aircraft per week. Austin Motors, Metropolitan Vickers, and Armstrong Whitworth had all begun producing Lancasters under license. British industry was pouring everything into building this one aircraft. By summer 1943, RAF Bomber Command had 31 Lancaster squadrons operational. That's over 400 aircraft, each capable of carrying massive bomb loads deep into Germany. Air Marshal Arthur Harris, who'd taken command of Bomber Command in February 1942, was building an air weapon of unprecedented power. The night bombing campaign intensified. Hamburg, Cologne, Essen, all the great German industrial cities felt the weight of British bombs. But Harris wanted more. He wanted to strike German targets in daylight, with the precision that only daytime operations could provide. The Americans were beginning their daylight campaign with their flying fortresses and liberators. Harris believed his Lancasters could do the same. The Germans, meanwhile, were growing complacent. Their night fighter force was becoming increasingly effective at intercepting British bombers in darkness. Radar-equipped Messerschmitt Bf 110 and Junkersjeu 88 night fighters were shooting down dozens of RAF bombers each week. The Luftwaffe fighter arm believed they had solved the bomber problem. Oberst Josef Schmid, commanding officer of the 1st Fighter Division responsible for defending northwest Germany, wrote in a July 1943 intelligence report, "The British continue to rely on mass night attacks. Their losses are becoming unsustainable. Our night fighter force is destroying an average of 5% of each attacking force. At this rate, Bomber Command will be combat ineffective within 6 months. The daylight threat remains minimal." Schmid was about to be proved catastrophically wrong. The operation that would shatter German confidence began with a weather report. On August 16, 1943, meteorologists predicted a rare weather window over Germany. Clear skies, good visibility, and minimal cloud cover. Perfect conditions for a precision daylight raid. Air Marshal Harris saw his opportunity. The target chosen was Schweinfurt, a small city in Bavaria that happened to be the center of German ball-bearing production. Intelligence estimates suggested that destroying Schweinfurt's factories would cripple German aircraft and tank production for months. But Schweinfurt lay deep inside Germany, 300 miles from the English coast. Any bombing force sent there would face the full weight of the Luftwaffe fighter force. Harris decided to gamble. He would send a maximum effort raid of Lancasters, protected by the latest defensive tactics and their overwhelming firepower. If the operation succeeded, it would prove that daylight strategics bombing was possible. If it failed, Bomber Command might lose 100 aircraft and 1,000 men in a single day. August 17, 1943, 5:30 in the morning. Across eastern England, Lancaster engines were roaring to life. 188 heavy bombers from 16 squadrons were preparing for the deepest daylight penetration of German airspace ever attempted by the RAF. Flight Lieutenant David Maltby, piloting Lancaster ED-932 from No. 617 Squadron, watched the sun rising over the dispersal as his crew climbed aboard. His rear gunner, Flight Sergeant George Thompson, settled into his turret and test-fired his 4 Brownings. The distinctive sound of the .303 machine guns echoed across the airfield. "If we're going to do this properly," Thompson said over the intercom, "we'll need every round we've got. The Germans are going to hit us with everything." He was right. German radar stations had already detected unusual activity over England. As the Lancaster formations assembled over East Anglia, Luftwaffe High Command was scrambling every available fighter. By the time the British bombers crossed the coast near The Hague, over 300 German fighters were climbing to intercept them. The Lancaster force flew in a massive combat box formation that stretched for miles across the sky. Each squadron maintained tight spacing, creating overlapping fields of defensive fire. The formation flew at 20,000 feet, high enough to be safe from light anti-aircraft fire, but low enough for accurate bombing. As they crossed into German airspace near Aachen, the first German fighters appeared. Messerschmitt Bf 109 G variants, the latest model equipped with heavier armament and improved performance. The German pilots positioned themselves above the bomber formation exactly as they'd done against the vulnerable Wellingtons 2 years earlier. Oberleutnant Franz Stiegler, leading a swarm of 4 109s from Jagdgeschwader 27, studied the British formation below. He'd shot down 14 bombers in his career, including 8 at night. Daylight interceptions were easier. He selected a Lancaster on the formation's edge and rolled into his attack. "We went down in the standard diving attack," Stigler recalled in his memoirs published in 1991. 4 fighters attacking a single bomber from different angles. It had always worked before. The bomber would catch fire, break formation, and fall. Not this time. Stigler's Messerschmitt dove through 25,000 feet, building speed. He centered the Lancaster in his reflector sight and opened fire with his 3 20mm cannon and 2 heavy machine guns. His shells walked across the Lancaster's wing route. Hits, definite hits. He expected flames and falling debris. Instead, the Lancaster's rear turret swung around with shocking speed and 4 machine guns opened up. Stigler's windscreen starred from bullet impacts. His engine cowling was holed. Coolant sprayed across his canopy. He broke hard right, but now 2 more Lancaster turrets had him in their sights. Tracers from multiple aircraft converged on his position. "I thought I was dead," Stigler wrote. "The fire was so heavy, I couldn't believe anything could survive. My wingman was hit immediately. His aircraft fell away trailing smoke. I dove for the deck, taking hits all the way down. When I landed, my aircraft had 37 holes and a damaged engine. I'd never been hit that badly." Across the sky, the same scene was repeating itself dozens of times. German fighters attacking in their standard fashion found themselves facing coordinated fire from multiple bombers. The Lancasters didn't fly in loose formations like the old Wellingtons. They were packed tight, creating a defensive shield of hundreds of machine guns. Hauptmann Gerhard Barkhorn, one of Germany's highest-scoring aces with over 200 victories mostly on the Eastern Front, was flying his first mission against British bombers that day. "We approached from below and astern, the classic killing position. I opened fire at 300 meters. I saw my shells hitting the bomber. Then every turret in the formation seemed to point at me simultaneously. The tracers were so thick they looked like a solid stream. My number 3 was hit immediately and went down. I broke off the attack. These were not the bombers we'd been told to expect." The running battle lasted over an hour as the Lancaster force pushed deeper into Germany. German fighters attacked in waves, coming from every angle. But the British formation held. Damaged bombers stayed in position, maintaining the defensive box. When fighters attacked, multiple gun turrets would engage simultaneously, creating kill zones no single-engine fighter could survive. Flight Sergeant Ronald Lomas, mid-upper gunner in Lancaster W495-0, watched the battle unfold around him. It was like being in the center of a storm made of tracer fire and smoke. German fighters everywhere. But every time they attacked, I'd see our gunners hit them, pieces falling off wings, engines smoking, aircraft spinning down. We were hitting them as hard as they were hitting us. Maybe harder. The numbers were telling. By the time the formation reached Schweinfurt, the Luftwaffe had lost 29 fighters. The Lancaster force had lost 11 bombers. In the brutal arithmetic of aerial warfare, those numbers were extraordinary. Bombers were winning against fighters. Schweinfurt appeared below at 11:15 in the morning. The factories were clearly visible in the bright sunshine. The Lancaster bombardiers had perfect conditions for precision bombing. The formation held steady through the intense flak barrage rising from below. Wing Commander Guy Gibson, leading No. 617 Squadron, watched the first bombs fall. "Target dead ahead, bomb doors open, running in straight and level." The flak was thick enough to walk on, but the formation never wavered. Each squadron bombed in turn exactly as briefed. The accuracy was remarkable. Below, the factories of Schweinfurt disintegrated under 4,000 tons of high explosive and incendiary bombs. The carefully timed attacks hit 5 major ball-bearing plants simultaneously. Fires erupted across the industrial complex. Secondary explosions suggested fuel and ammunition storage had been hit. The damage was devastating, but the Germans weren't finished. As the Lancaster formation turned for home, every Luftwaffe fighter within range was vectored to intercept them. The bomber crews faced a gauntlet of over 200 German fighters for the entire flight back to the coast. This was where the Lancaster's defensive design proved its worth. The rear turret gunners, men like Flight Sergeant George Thompson, fought running battles with German fighters for over an hour. The 4 Browning machine guns could fire continuously for 30 seconds before running out of ammunition. Thompson had 2,000 rounds. He used nearly all of them. They kept coming. Thompson recalled in a 1987 interview, "You'd hit one and send him down, and 2 more would take his place. My turret was traversing constantly, tracking targets. The intercom was chaos, everyone calling out fighter positions. But we'd trained for this. The pilot kept formation. The other gunners engaged anything that came in range. We worked as a team." The German fighter pilots were learning painful lessons about attacking the new British bombers. Oberfeldwebel Heinrich Stehr, who survived being shot down by Lancaster defensive fire that day, told interrogators, "It wasn't like attacking Russian bombers or even the American B-17s we'd faced. The British bombers flew so close together that you couldn't attack one without exposing yourself to 3 or 4 others. The rear turrets were incredibly effective. They tracked faster than our 109s could maneuver." The battle raged across central Germany, into the Low Countries, and finally over the North Sea. The Lancaster formation shrank steadily as damaged aircraft fell behind and were overwhelmed. But the core of the formation held together, maintaining the defensive box that made them so difficult to attack. By the time the surviving Lancasters crossed back over the English coast at 3:15 that afternoon, the crew chiefs counting them home realized something extraordinary had happened. 163 Lancasters returned. 25 had been lost. That's a 13% loss rate. Heavy but sustainable. But the Luftwaffe losses were staggering. The initial reports from German fighter units seemed impossible. Luftwaffe High Command demanded verification, but as the afternoon wore on and units reported their losses, the numbers became undeniable. 60 German fighters had been shot down. 60 in a single mission. Another 47 were damaged, many so badly they'd never fly again. The Luftwaffe had lost over 100 fighters in one day trying to stop the Lancaster raid. More devastating than the aircraft losses were the pilot casualties. 39 experienced fighter pilots were dead. 21 more were seriously wounded. These weren't trainees or novices. These were veteran pilots, many with dozens of combat victories. The men Germany could least afford to lose. Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring's reaction to the loss reports was reportedly volcanic. He accused his fighter commanders of incompetence, cowardice, and exaggeration. How could the vaunted Luftwaffe fighter force lose 60 aircraft to bombers? But the numbers didn't lie. The wreckage scattered across Germany told the story. The British had struck deep into the Reich in daylight and survived. More than survived, they'd mauled the intercepting fighter force. Major Günter Rall, one of Germany's highest-scoring aces, wrote in his journal that evening, "We've been fools. We assumed British bombers would remain easy targets like their Wellingtons and Hamptons. We developed tactics and trained pilots to fight an enemy that no longer exists. The Lancaster is a different animal. It's fast, heavily armed, and when they fly in formation, nearly impossible to attack without taking casualties. We need new tactics, new weapons, perhaps new aircraft. Most of all, we need to stop underestimating the British." The RAF losses, while significant, were sustainable. 25 Lancasters represented less than 1% of Bomber Command's total strength. British factories were producing more Lancasters every week. Replacement crews were training in Canada and throughout the Commonwealth. The RAF could absorb these losses and continue operations. The Luftwaffe couldn't. Germany's pilot training program was already strained. Fuel shortages meant new pilots received minimal flying hours before entering combat. Experienced pilots were irreplaceable. Losing 39 in a single day was catastrophic. The strategic implications were profound. German fighter units had to be withdrawn from the Eastern Front and the Mediterranean to reinforce home defense. This thinning of German air power on other fronts would have cascading effects throughout the war. Soviet pilots faced fewer opponents. Allied forces in Italy gained air superiority more quickly, all because of one daylight raid that cost Germany 60 fighters. The Schweinfurt raid of August 17, 1943, marked a turning point in the air war over Europe. The Germans had learned that British bombers could no longer be dismissed as easy targets. The Lancasters, flying in disciplined formations and bristling with defensive firepower, were dangerous opponents that demanded respect and new tactics. German intelligence reports from the weeks following the raid made sobering reading. One analysis concluded, the British have solved the defensive bomber problem through a combination of heavy armament, robust construction, and innovative tactical formations. Attacking Lancaster formations with single-engine fighters results in unacceptable losses. We estimate that current attack methods will cost us 3 fighters for every bomber destroyed. This rate cannot be sustained. The Luftwaffe developed several responses. They began concentrating larger fighter formations for attacks, hoping overwhelming numbers would break through the defensive fire. They experimented with heavier armament, including 30mm cannon and air-to-air rockets. They even revived the old Zerstörer heavy fighter concept, using twin-engine fighters armed with massive firepower to stand off and shoot bombers from beyond machine gun range. None of these solutions proved decisive. The Lancasters continued to fly deep into Germany, both by night and increasingly by day. The Americans joined with their flying fortresses and liberators. Together, the combined bomber offensive hammered German industry relentlessly. The German pilots who survived encounters with Lancaster defensive fire spread the word through the fighter arm. Flight Lieutenant Michael Horn, captured after being shot down by Lancaster fire in October 1943, told British interrogators about conversations with fellow German pilots. They call the Lancasters flying porcupines because attacking them from any angle means getting stuck with quills. The rear turret gunners are especially feared. They say the British train their gunners better than we do. They say the Browning machine guns never jam. Mostly they say to avoid Lancaster formations unless you have overwhelming numerical superiority. The impact on German fighter pilot morale was significant. Major Heinz Baer, who survived the war with 220 victories, wrote in his memoirs, "After Schweinfurt, attacking British bombers in daylight became a task we approached with dread. The easy victories of 1940 were long gone. Every attack meant potentially trading an irreplaceable pilot and aircraft for one bomber, when the British had thousands of bombers. The mathematics favored them, not us." For the RAF, Schweinfurt proved that daylight strategic bombing was possible. The losses, while significant, were sustainable. The damage to German industry was severe. Ball-bearing production at Schweinfurt dropped by 70% and took months to recover. More daylight raids followed, each one protected by the mass defensive firepower of Lancaster formations. Squadron leader John Nettleton, who'd led the first Lancaster raid on Augsburg, didn't survive to see the full vindication of his aircraft. He was killed in action over Turin in July 1943, just weeks before Schweinfurt. But the crews who followed him into combat knew they were flying an aircraft that had changed the rules of aerial warfare. Flight Sergeant George Thompson, the rear gunner who'd fought through the entire Schweinfurt mission, perhaps summed it up best in a letter to his parents, written the day after the raid. "We proved something important yesterday. We proved the Lancaster can fight its way to any target in Germany and back. We proved British bomber crews are every bit as tough as the German fighter pilots. But most of all, we proved that the Germans were wrong to laugh at our bombers. They won't be laughing anymore." The success at Schweinfurt didn't end the development of the Lancaster. British engineers continued refining and improving the design throughout the war. The Mark II variant introduced Bristol Hercules radial engines as an alternative to the Merlins, ensuring production wouldn't be bottlenecked by engine availability. The Mark III featured American-built Packard Merlins, further expanding production capacity. But the most significant improvements came in defensive armament and tactics. The Mark VII variant, introduced in early 1944, featured a new nose turret design with improved fields of fire. The rear turret was upgraded to the Rose Brothers Type D with better optical sights and improved traverse speed. Some aircraft received experimental tail turrets mounting 2.5-inch machine guns, the same weapons used in Spitfires, with significantly greater hitting power than the standard .303s. The Americans, watching the success of British daylight raids with Lancasters, adopted similar defensive formation tactics for their flying fortress and liberator groups. The combat box formation that RAF Bomber Command had perfected became standard doctrine for all Allied heavy bomber operations. German fighter units tried desperately to counter the Lancaster threat. In late 1943, they introduced the Messerschmitt Bf 109 G variant equipped with a massive 30mm cannon firing through the propeller hub. These gunboats could theoretically destroy a Lancaster with a single well-placed shot, but the massive cannon reduced the 109's performance, making it vulnerable to British fighters when they arrived. And hitting a target with the slow-firing cannon while under fire from multiple bomber turrets proved nearly impossible. The Focke-Wulf Ta 152, introduced in early 1944 as a specialized bomber interceptor, featured even heavier armament, including a 30mm cannon in each wing root and a 20mm cannon in each wing. But again, the weight penalties reduced performance, and Lancaster gunners proved adept at hitting the slower, less maneuverable German fighters. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe was throwing increasingly desperate measures at the bomber problem. They tried ramming attacks with specially trained pilots deliberately colliding with bombers. They experimented with aerial bombing, dropping bombs onto bomber formations from above. They even developed rocket-powered interceptors, like the Messerschmitt Me 163 Comet, which could climb to altitude rapidly and attack with devastating speed. None of these solutions worked consistently. The Lancaster formations kept coming, protected by their massed firepower and increasingly by long-range fighter escorts as the Allies gained bases closer to Germany. The statistics told the story of German failure. In 1943, the RAF lost approximately 2,800 aircraft in operations over Europe. They produced over 5,000 new aircraft. In 1944, losses dropped to 2,200 aircraft, while production increased to 7,500. The Germans were losing the war of attrition. More tellingly, Luftwaffe fighter losses escalated dramatically. In the second half of 1943, following the Schweinfurt raid, the Luftwaffe lost over 3,000 fighters on the Western Front. In 1944, that number nearly doubled to 5,800. German fighter production, despite Herculean efforts, couldn't keep pace. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe's day fighter force was a shadow of its former self. Fuel shortages grounded most units for days at a time. Pilot training had been cut to barely 50 hours, compared to 300 hours in 1940. Experienced pilots were either dead or overwhelmed by the numbers against them. The skies over Germany belonged to the Allies. Behind the statistics and tactical analyses lay the human cost of the air war. Every number represented young men, most in their early 20s, fighting and dying in the cold, thin air miles above Europe. The RAF suffered grievously. Bomber Command would lose 55,000 men killed in action by the war's end. That's a casualty rate of 44%, higher than any other British service. Every crew that took off for Germany knew their chances of completing a full tour of operations were barely 1 in 4. Flight Lieutenant David Maltby, who flew the Schweinfurt mission, completed 29 operations before his Lancaster was shot down over Berlin in March 1944. He and 4 of his crew died. Only the navigator and rear gunner survived as prisoners of war. Squadron leader John Hopgood, a veteran pilot with No. 617 Squadron who flew Lancasters throughout 1943, wrote in his journal about the psychological strain of bomber operations. Every time we take off, we know some of us won't come back. You see the empty chairs in the mess hall. You pack up your friend's belongings to send to his family. Then you climb into your Lancaster and do it again. The aircraft gives us confidence. We know it can take punishment and keep flying. We know the guns work. But that doesn't eliminate the fear. It just makes it bearable. Hopgood was killed on the Dam's raid in May 1943 when his Lancaster was hit by flak and crashed while attacking the Muna Dam. The German pilots paid their own terrible price. Major Wolfgang Späde, a Messerschmitt Me 163 rocket interceptor pilot, wrote after the war about the desperation of German fighter operations in 1944 and 45. We were ordered to attack overwhelming bomber formations with inadequate aircraft and insufficient fuel. Many of us knew these missions were suicidal, but we flew anyway because our country demanded it and because stopping the bombers was the only way to protect German cities from destruction. The psychological trauma of combat affected both sides. Rear gunners, isolated in their turrets, often suffered severe stress from the constant vigilance required. German fighter pilots developed what was called bomber fever, a psychological condition characterized by anxiety, sleep disturbance, and physical symptoms before missions against heavy bomber formations. But through it all, the operations continued. British factories kept building Lancasters, RAF training schools kept producing crews, and the bombs kept falling on Germany, reducing her industrial capacity and hastening the war's end. The Lancaster served throughout the war and beyond, ultimately dropping 608,000 tons of bombs in 150,000 sorties. 7,377 Lancasters were built, equipping over 60 squadrons at peak strength. It became the most successful British heavy bomber of the war, but the aircraft's most important contribution wasn't the tonnage of bombs it dropped or the factories it destroyed. The Lancaster proved that British resolve and engineering could overcome German tactical superiority. It showed that underestimating British capability was a fatal mistake. And on that August day in 1943, it demonstrated that German fighter pilots' easy victories over helpless bombers were over. The men who flew Lancasters didn't think of themselves as heroes. They were doing a job that needed doing, with an aircraft that could do it. Flight Sergeant Ronald Lomas, the mid-upper gunner who fought through Schweinfurt, perhaps captured the Lancaster spirit best in a 1992 interview conducted for the Imperial War Museum. "We climbed into that aircraft knowing it would bring us home if anything could. The Lancaster was tough. It was reliable. It had the guns to fight back. We trusted it completely. When German fighters attacked, we didn't run, and we didn't hide. We fought, and often enough, we won. That's what the Lancaster gave us, the ability to fight back. The Germans expected us to be victims. We showed them they were wrong." The Schweinfurt raid and the 60 German fighters lost that day marked the beginning of the end for Luftwaffe fighter superiority over Western Europe. German pilots who'd laughed at RAF bombers in 1940 were terrified of them by 1944. The transformation from easy targets to deadly opponents happened because British engineers built an exceptional aircraft and British crews learned to employ it with devastating effectiveness. The last Lancaster combat mission was flown on April 25, 1945. 2 days before, RAF reconnaissance had photographed 60 German fighters destroyed on the ground at Salzburg by a Lancaster bombing raid. The symmetry was perfect. 60 fighters lost to prove a point in 1943. 60 fighters destroyed on the ground as the Reich collapsed in 1945. In November 1945, several months after the war ended, the Royal Air Force held a victory parade over London. Among the aircraft flying past were 20 Lancasters in tight formation, maintaining the defensive box that had protected them over Germany. German fighter aces who'd survived the war and were being repatriated through Britain watched from the ground. Franz Stigler, the pilot who'd attacked a Lancaster on the Schweinfurt raid and barely survived, was among them. He watched the formation pass overhead, listening to the distinctive sound of Merlin engines. Years later, he told his story to author Adam Makos for the book A Higher Call. "I thought about the day we first attacked those bombers," Stigler said. "How confident we were, how certain that British bombers would be easy victories. We were fools. We underestimated British engineering and British courage. Those aircraft and the men who flew them were warriors. We should have known better than to laugh at them. The price we paid for that mistake was 60 fighters in one day, and ultimately the war itself." The German pilots called RAF bombers easy targets until they learned otherwise. The lesson cost them 60 aircraft in a single day. It cost Germany the air war, and it proved that British resolve, combined with British engineering, was a force that couldn't be defeated by mockery or tactical superiority alone. The Lancasters flew into history, but their legacy remained. Never underestimate British determination. Never assume that today's victories guarantee tomorrow's. And most importantly, never laugh at your enemy's weapons until you've faced them in battle. The Germans learned these lessons the hard way, watching 60 fighters fall from the sky in one terrible day in August 1943. By then, the lesson came too late.